The Atari 2600 had a lifespan that lasted from 1977 until it was officially decommissioned in 1992, which is pretty remarkable considering it operated with a CPU that had a whopping 1.19 MHz of processing power. During that lengthy time frame, many ports of popular arcade cabinets made their way onto Atari's home console, and although the hardware had its limitations, some of these ports were still very well done. It's Atari 2600 arcade ports that were actually fun on this edition of Friday Night Arcade. Let's get things started with one of the obvious ones. First of all, just about everyone knows the port of the original Pac-Man on Atari was bad. Really bad. But they made up for it with the port of Mrs. Pac-Man, which is actually quite good. There are other better ways to play this game in the modern era, sure, but this was as good as you could have hoped for at the time, and it's still very playable today. You're still gobbling up little rectangles instead of pellets, but Mrs. Pac-Man's animations are nice, the ghosts all behave like they should, and it all plays relatively smoothly on the hardware. All of the memorable sounds from the arcade version are well represented here as well. What can you say? It's Mrs. Pac-Man on Atari, and it's still very playable today just as it was 30 years ago.
Star Wars. It's great in the arcade. Whoa! TIE fighters! Fireballs! Coming right at me! Watch the laser towers. Aim for the tops. Pick in the cannons. Use the force. They're coming too fast! Which way? Which way? My shields are gone! All right! I'm going in!
Oh, some game, huh?
Some game!
That man's family is still looking for him to this day. I hope he's okay. Star Wars, the poster child for movies that needed video game adaptations, Star Wars got an arcade release in 1983 that was later ported to the 2600 by Parker Brothers. The home console version is not bad. The game goes in 3 phases to simulate the Death Star assault. First you fight off some TIE fighters, then you cruise along the surface of the Death Star taking out gunner towers, and for the finale you enter the trench run. That sounds like a lot, but you can get through the whole thing in about 2 minutes, so really there's not much to it other than trying to rack up a high score. But it does get more difficult after the first round. Okay, the tower phase leaves a lot to the imagination, but the 3D effects in the trench run are quite good for the time. Obviously, there are better Star Wars games out there today, but this is worth checking out just to see how far these games have come in the past 3 decades.
I'm going out to inspect the troops.
Yes, sir.
Regular change today, General?
This is Atari Missile Command. Millions of people are mad for it in thousands of game centers across the country.
Interplanetary war is hurt.
Attention all generals. Now you can get your own Atari Missile Command video game and practice saving the world in the privacy of your home.
What happens when your nation is in the middle of a Cold War with Mother Russia and there's paranoia about what would happen if one country went nuts and decided to pepper the other country with a bunch of nuclear bombs? Well, that's what Atari attempted to find out in 1980 with the arcade version of Missile Command, which was ported to the 2600 a year later. You have to defend cities against a never-ending barrage of bombs by firing off these missiles into the air that explode and take out everything around them. I always thought this game was ridiculously addictive good fun. Like any Atari game, it starts off super chill, taking out some bombs, not too bad, but before long the amounts of missiles on screen at once goes haywire and you're frantically moving the cursor around all over the place. The sound effects are fantastic and the game over screen taunts you with nuclear annihilation. The trick here is to have faith in wherever you targeted your missiles as your cursor is haphazardly careening across the screen. You can't linger in one place too long because odds are the next batch of bombs is coming in on the opposite side of the screen. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to briefly mention a few titles that I've already covered more extensively in previous videos. First up is Space Invaders. I absolutely love the port of Space Invaders on the 2600, and frankly, I played it so much as a kid that I enjoyed this version far more than the original arcade version. The amount of enemies on screen is just right, and the controls are perfect. Next up is Frogger, which I just recently covered, but it's worth mentioning again. Obviously, this version doesn't look nearly as detailed as the arcade counterpart, but it didn't have to. It plays smoothly, the graphics are simple but effective, and the sound effects are great. The game is still as addictive and easy to pick up and play as it was 30 years ago. Asteroids. While certainly not perfect, what they did here with the Atari 2600 version is impressive. Having all of these asteroids floating around on screen at once and splitting into multiple pieces is pretty neat when you consider what they were working with. My only gripe with the 2600 version is that it never fails. At least once a round, I end up accidentally pressing the joystick down while trying to turn the ship around, which causes your ship to warp across the screen. Then I end up getting smacked into by an asteroid and wasting a life. Lastly, I have to mention Cosmic Arc. This is still one of my favorite Atari 2600 games, plus the box art is this cool silver foil wrapping. So I mean, how could you possibly go wrong? The game has two phases. First, you start off in space blasting meteors before they hit your ship, then in phase 2 you descend to the planet below and have to pick up 2 of whatever species is there. I only found this out recently, but Cosmic Arc, produced by iMagic in 1982, was technically a clone of the 1980 Midway release, Space Sap. Space Sap was really only the first level of Cosmic Arc, where you're in space shooting off the meteors, and it was developed by a different company altogether, but when else am I going to have a chance to mention this? Okay, getting back to business. Kung Fu Master, developed by Irem in 1984 and ported to the 2600 by Activision. The Atari 2600 port of this was recently brought to my attention by a few viewers, so thanks for the heads up, guys. I had no idea this version even existed. That's what I love about doing this channel, is that a lot of times I end up finding out just as much or more from your feedback as I do from my own independent research. So, thanks guys, I appreciate your help. Anyway, Kung Fu Master is a side-scroller where you take control of Thomas and you're trying to smash your way through a bunch of thugs to rescue Princess Victoria, who's being held captive in the evil wizard's temple. There are actually 5 levels to fight through here, just like in the arcade, and although the graphics are primitive, this actually looks better than a few NES games I've seen. The sprites are chunky and very detailed. Activision used the same voodoo smoke and mirrors to pull off a soundtrack in this game, similar to what they did with Pitfall 2, utilizing additional chips in the cartridge itself. Your character even has a life bar, and there's also a boss with its own life bar at the end of the stage. They had to get a little creative porting an arcade game with 2 buttons onto a system that only has 1 button, so some of the moves got taken out, but still, this is pretty cool for its time and the hardware. Next up, Rampage. Now, you youngsters out there may be confused and think this game might be based on the movie Rampage. Well, believe it or not, it's actually the other way around. The year was 1986. Ronald Reagan was president, the highest grossing films were Top Gun, Crocodile Dundee, and Platoon, and Dwayne Johnson wasn't in every single movie that comes out. It was a wonderful time to be alive. And it was also when Bally Midway released the first version of Rampage in the arcades. Up to 3 players could play simultaneously as monsters, smashing buildings while avoiding gunfire from helicopters and police cars. Rack up points by smashing as many buildings as you can until you run out of quarters. The game was very successful and ported to several other systems, including the Atari 2600. Once again, Activision handled the port, and it should come as no surprise that they did as good a job as you could ask for. You can only play 1 player at a time, but you can still select any of the 3 monsters, which is nice. The sound effects sound like actual buildings being smashed to bits and helicopters firing down on you. The buildings are destructible, which is cool even though the physics don't make much sense. Am I climbing up the air here? What's going on? There's little people flailing their arms for help in the buildings and you can eat them. There's even little cutscenes between stages. Imagine that, an Atari game with cutscenes. The play control, it's a little awkward, and realistically by 1986 you would probably have been playing this on the NES instead. But you can't help but tip your cap to them for attempting this on the 2600 and somehow pulling it off. Well, that wraps it up for this week. What did you think? What were some of your favorite arcade games on the Atari? For that matter, what were some of your favorite arcade games? One of these days, I suppose I should actually do a video about arcade games since it's in the name of the channel. Hey, I wanted to let you know too that there is a Friday Night Arcade official Discord server now. Think of it as like a 24/7 chat room where everyone can hang out and talk about games or whatever. There's an invite link in the description. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please don't text and drive, and I'll see you next time on Friday Night Arcade.